In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. In your patience, possess ye your souls, or win ye your souls. In your patience, possess ye your souls. I think in our culture, we have the wrong idea about patience. We think patience is somehow when a person just doesn't get upset about things, doesn't get irritated, can wait in line, is in traffic and hauled up and doesn't get excited about it, doesn't get upset about it. We have that idea about patience. We have this idea that patience is sort of a meekness and sort of a just being calm. Patience is a choice. Patience is an action. Christian patience is much different than that idea of patience. Now, it can incorporate that idea because a person who's making active choices to follow the commandments is going to act appropriately in situations and not get angry because a car cuts them off or because they're in traffic or because they're on a phone helpline and it's taking too long or they get disconnected or something like that. Of course. But patience is very active. So if you have a prayer rule that you rarely say, you're not very patient. If you start doing prostrations but then kind of tail off and don't do them for long periods of time, you're not very patient. If you read the gospel on Monday and Tuesday and not until next week, you're not very patient. If you come to the vigil service and 2-3 weeks in a row and then start being every other week, every third week, every month, once in a while, you're not very patient. Because patience is endurance. Patience is to do the right thing because of God, not because of whatever effect it might have on us. Which one of us in every vigil pays attention the entire time? Or always feels like, I really want to be here? Very few of us. I have a little secret for you. I feel that more often as a priest that I'm thinking, oh my goodness, there's so much left to go because then I have confessions afterwards and this and that. When I was a layman, I didn't really have that feeling. To me, the vigil was the best time of the entire day, of the entire week. But it's a little different now that I'm a priest. But maybe for some of you, you get bored or your feet hurt or you got other things to do and things interfere with your prayer rule or reading the scriptures or reading the Psalter, all the kind of stuff that I tell you to do all the time. You're not very patient. So how are you going to get patient? So when I see things like, in your patience, possess ye your souls, to me, that's a question. I read almost everything as a question. And I think we should answer all questions. So that is, how are you going to get patient, Seraphim? How are you going to do it? What are you going to do to become really patient? And I want to share with you a few things about that. The gospel for St. John Kochurov is this one about martyrdom and how it says, before all of these they shall lay their hands on you, persecute you, delivering you up to the synagogues, into prisons, being brought before kings and rulers for my name's sake. And it shall turn to you for a testimony. Settle it therefore in your hearts. Not to meditate, what ye shall answer. And then he tells them why. And in the end, after he says that they'll be brought before synagogues and put in prison and even be killed, in your patience possess ye your souls. So the second thing that I've highlighted, settle it therefore in your hearts. Read that as a question. How are you going to settle things in your hearts? You're just going to study? Are you going to read the things about the martyrs? And are you going to read the things about in the Gospels and the Psalter and kind of have that all at your fingertips so that when you're brought before kings and governors and senators and drug companies and all the rest, that you'll be ready for that? Is that what you're going to do, to settle it in your heart? And that's not at all what's going to happen. Now, you should be reading those things because that's how you learn things. How do you settle it in your heart? You settle it in your heart by having God in your heart. That's how you settle it in your heart. You settle it in your heart by living patiently. And the other virtues as well, love and compassion and meekness and humility. But patience is endurance. Don't think of patience as something passive. Patience is not passive. Patience is very, very active. Patience is always making a choice. You always make a choice. Everything in life should be a choice. Don't ever fall into things in life by inertia. You do it because it's the right thing to do. You don't do it because it's not the right thing to do. Even if not doing it makes it more difficult for you, and even if doing it doesn't seem to improve matters. Because in your heart is God, and the light of God is shining in your heart, and you feel God resonating in your heart. Now, for some of you that don't, well, you just have to work harder. You have to do a little bit more effort. We are in a society that doesn't like effort. You know, now we have people that will watch literally hours and hours of 30-second or 10-second or 15-second videos, one after the other. What's that doing to their soul and to their mind? It's not doing anything good, because there's no patience there, there's no endurance there. There's going from one thing to another, one biologically, one dopamine hit to another. But Christianity is not dopamine hits. Christianity is endurance because God is in the heart, and because you know the right thing to do, and because the right thing is the only thing to do. You don't consider yourself to have another option. Not that you don't have other options. You can do anything you want. But most of the things that you want to do probably aren't very good. Or the ones that you would fall into, they're terrible. So how do you settle it in your heart and be patient and win your soul? Let's look at the epistle also for St. John Kochurov. And in it, it says that we know all things work together for good to them that love God, who are called according to his purpose. Okay, that's a good factoid to know, but it's useless if you know it as a factoid. It's only useful if you know it in your heart, if it resonates in your heart. All things work together for good to them that love God and who are called according to his purpose. All the difficulties in your life, all the joys in your life, all the sorrows in your life, everything happens for your good. Do you believe it or not? You might say you believe it because, you're theologically astute. You know that's true because God is all good and everything's under the providence of God and blah, blah, blah. But does it resonate in your heart that all things work together for good? Well, it does if you're struggling. If you're reading and prostrating and praying for others and forgiving your enemy and coming to the services, then it will resonate with you, and you'll know that everything works for good to those who are called according to his purpose. Everything. St. Paul goes on to say, for whom he did foreknow, he did predestinate to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brethren. A much understood verse, really very easy. For Orthodox to understand, it's very easy to understand this verse. Only a few hundred years ago did people just lose their minds and not understand what this means. God in his mind knew us before we were born. And his desire for us is to be conformed to his image. So he made us in order to be conformed to his image. He didn't force us to be conformed to his image. We're made in his image, but we are to obtain his likeness. So really to be conformed in his image is to become according to his likeness. Because we're made as we are. And we have the capacity to know God, the capacity to become good and holy and full of light. And we choose to become good and holy and full of light or not. And God saw in his mind that some of us would, unfortunately some of us would not. If we know that we are going to be conformed to the image of God, we're going to obtain his likeness, if we really understand that, then everything fits in perspective. It really doesn't matter what's going on in the world. What matters is what's going on in your heart. And that's how you settle it, therefore, in your heart. And that's how you have patience where you possess your soul. Because you're aware of what your purpose is. Those who've known me for, 3 days or more, know that the most important thing I talk about, I just incessantly talk about it, is purpose. What is your purpose in life? If you know your purpose, then you live according to it. Then everything makes sense. If you don't have a purpose, or if your purpose is changing, which is the equivalent of not having a purpose, then you're confused and you lose patience because something doesn't work. You go to another thing. Something works for a little while, you stay with it, but then you forget even why you were doing it. Not that you forget in your mind, you just kind of drift away from it. And then there you are, going up and down, like the double-minded man who's unstable in all of his ways. That double-minded man, he thinks he knows something about God. He thinks something about what his life is about, but he also thinks other things. And those things erode his understanding of what his purpose is. So all the time you should be adjusting your understanding of what your purpose is. Now, of course, I give it in a very simple way. It's to become like God. It's to have the likeness of God in us. And it's to be united with God, to be completely light, to have no darkness in us whatsoever, to become like God, so that we know him. But we can refine the understanding of this as we live it, because the more we become like God, the more we know about the things in us that are unlike God. And the more the heart resonates with God, and the more we are absolutely sure as we are that we breathe air, as sure as you are that the sun is in the sky, more sure than that God is, and God resides in our heart. That's how you settle it, therefore, in your hearts. And I would submit to you that we need to be doing that a lot more than if we were born in the 50s. Well, unless you were born in the 50s in the Soviet Union, then you'd need to be doing it. But if you're born in the 50s, let's say, in America, and, right when rock and roll's starting and everything, you don't really have to work that hard to live. You can be a Christian and not really be challenged. What a terrible thing. What a sad thing to be a Christian and not be challenged and not have God resonate in your heart. You don't have to pay really a price in this world for it, but you do pay a price in the next. But in this world now, in 2022, things are getting dangerous, very dangerous. So we must really prepare ourselves. And you don't prepare yourself by making sure you have enough food and water and shotgun shells and all that sort of thing. That's not how you prepare. You prepare by settling it in your heart, that God is in your heart, and that you live according to God. And then you have patience. You make a choice to do things that are patient. You endure. So those of you that have a prayer rule that goes up and down, you're not patient. You're at risk. You're at terrible risk. Because if things get very, very difficult for you, what are you going to reach back and hold on to? Those of you who sometimes read the Scriptures and sometimes don't, or never read the Scriptures, or rarely read the Scriptures, you're at risk. Because things are going to get difficult. And it's going to be hard for you to make the right choices. Because you're accustomed to being passive about your faith. Faith is not passive. Faith is very active. Faith is making choices. And faith is even making violent choices, because that's what the Scripture says, that the violent are taking heaven by force. How are they doing this? They're doing this by being violent against their sins, being violent against the things that are dead, and aggressively pursuing the things that are alive. And if they do that, then there is God in the heart. And you feel God in the heart. And that's how you have patience and endurance. Now, at the end of the Luke, it says that not a hair of your head shall perish. And then he says, in your patience shall ye possess your souls. Well, people who are being persecuted, there's a lot of hairs perishing. But what he means by this is not your body. He means your soul. So many people, their body remains intact, but they're dead inside. Including people that walk through Orthodox churches and walk into them and worship and sing in the choir and take communion and all the rest. Even priests that serve. They're dead inside because there's not endurance in them. I find that one of the biggest challenges as a priest is endurance. Because things, well, they rarely go well, to be honest with you. And When they're not going well, what am I going to do? Am I still going to pray? Am I still going to do my prostrations? Am I still going to be kind? Am I still going to be engaged? Well, that's a question that I have to answer every day. And you have to answer that question also. And if you have endurance, which is patience, then you get through things. Life is difficult. We all know that. Well, maybe not all of us. Some of the children might not have learned that yet. And sometimes they might think life is difficult if they don't get something they want or something of that nature. But we know as adults that there's a lot of terrible things that happen in the world, and even terrible things that we think and sometimes that we've done. What are you going to do about that? How are you going to possess your soul when you have all that stuff going on and all those distractions and all those difficulties and all that sadness and all that depravity all around you? How do you remain patient? Well, not by being passive, by being active. So that's my message to you today. Patience is not passive. It is active. You must make active choices. And if you don't have a very good prayer rule, well, you're really in the soup. You got troubles. You got a lot more troubles than you think about. Maybe you think your job's not so good, or that your house has leaks, or that you have troubles with relationships with certain people. You think those things are hard. It's really hard to not have a prayer rule, because then what you're doing is you're basically cut off from life if you don't have a prayer rule that you follow. It's just as simple as that. And I would say probably that, from my experience, the majority of you don't have much of a prayer rule. And that's sad. And when I became a priest, I had a prayer rule, and I prayed, and I was very active. I've always been very active as a priest, going everywhere, doing this, doing that, serving liturgy in people's houses and all kinds of things, making missionary trips for serving liturgy and for catechesis, all this stuff. And it got very burdensome for me. Not the doing of the things, but that the weight of people, because a lot of times things don't go well. And I had to learn that, wait a minute, I don't really pray. I got to learn to pray. That's why I'm always telling you, do prostrations. Maybe half of you are doing them. All of you should be doing them. And that's why I tell you to read the Psalter. Maybe a quarter of you are doing that. All of you should be doing that. And of course, fasting and all the rest. Because this invigorates the soul. And the soul then is more alive and more aware of God. And then God comes into the soul, shines His grace, His light, His energy into the soul. And the soul is warmed. And the soul is enlarged. The scriptural term, enlarged. And then we're ready for everything. That's how we settle it in our hearts. And you better be doing it. Because right now we're gathering completely free. We don't worry about the fact that our cell phones are picking up every word we say in this church right now. We're not that concerned about it. There'll be a time when we're going to be putting cell phones in Faraday cages or not having them at all. It'll happen. And then what are you going to do? How are you going to be ready? I have to tell you the story. I've told you the story before. A dear friend of mine committed suicide. And the reason he committed suicide is because he just didn't do enough. He didn't pray. He didn't fast. He didn't read the scriptures. I found out years after I'd known him that when I told him, let's read a certain scripture, he was really troubled. He didn't even have a Bible in his house. He hadn't had one for 10 years. And when he was really troubled by something, he didn't find a way out. Then he was in his cups, and he committed suicide. He didn't have anything to reach back to. He had no strength. He didn't know how to pray because he rarely prayed. So basically, he had no patience. So when it came that there was this crisis in his heart, he didn't think to pray. He didn't think to pick up the phone and call me and say, come over quickly. He didn't do anything except take a gun and use it. Because he didn't have any strength. So this suicide was basically 20 years, basically 15 years that I knew him, 15 years in the making. Because he didn't do Christian things. He talked about them, but he did them so inconsistently as to not really do them at all. Now maybe that's a worst case scenario. Maybe you think, oh, I'm not going to commit suicide. Well, I suppose not. The odds are that very few of us, maybe none of us in this room, will commit suicide. But the odds are very high that someone among us, maybe many people among us, will commit a type of spiritual suicide by living in this haphazard way and not being patient, not having endurance, not having God resonate in the heart, not having God settling it in your heart that God is with you, and therefore everything is under the providence of God, and that indeed you are predestined to be according to His image, according to His likeness, and that's all that matters in life. So if you really understand that, that directs everything you do. And then you're not going to be like my good friend, who I miss every day and I pray for every day, that had a crisis happen and he had nothing to hold on to. Nothing at all. All of us are going to have crises. And when you have a crisis, what are you going to do? I mean, you're going to talk to a best friend? They don't know how to help you. Are you going to read a book? You're going to open a bottle? What are you going to do when you have a crisis? When you have a crisis, God has to be in the heart. And if God is already in the heart, then with the crisis, God fills us. He gives us the strength. He tells us what to say. He helps us to get through the difficulty. But if God is not in the heart, and if we're haphazard about God, and if we're not patient about the way we live our life, meaning we don't endure, we don't have endurance about the things and consistency about the things that we should be doing, then when there's a crisis, we're in big trouble. And everybody in this room is going to have multiple crises. And I think for the Christian community, the true Christian community, not the one that is called Christian and does anything they want, but the true Christian community, the Orthodox Christian community, a subset of people who call themselves Orthodox, by the way, it will be very difficult. There will be crises. Are you ready for them? You're ready for them if day to day you're living with patience, you're living with endurance, you're struggling to say your prayers, you're struggling to love your neighbor, you're struggling to love your enemy, that your perspective is you're predestined to be conformed to the image of the Son of God and to become like God. If you know all those things and you do all those things as best you can, then you'll be ready. Now, I hope that somebody, I don't really know. That's one of the things about being a priest is you have no idea. You cast your seed upon the ground and you don't know whether the bird snatched it up, whether it grew for a little while or not. You don't really know. But I would hope that somebody in this room is thinking, what am I doing? My prayer rule is almost non-existent. I've got to change. I'm going to do something. Starting today, I'm going to do something. And keep doing it. I hope somebody in this room does that. And the rest of us that still have that of a prayer rule, we can improve it, can't we? We can get better. We can get better at a lot of things. We've got to make choices to be better. Not because we're supposed to, not because I told you to, not even because the gospel tells you to. It's because God in the heart is telling you to. That's our motivation, is God abiding in the heart. That's how we have it settled in our heart. Christianity is an aggressive faith. There is nothing passive about Christianity. We might be passive in how we interact with people, but that's an aggressive choice. Don't ever forget that. Don't be passive in how you live your life. When you have your thumbs on your phone and things are flipping by, you're being passive. When you got a channel changer in your hand and you're sitting there for 2 or 3 hours, you're being passive. Now, when you're reading the scriptures, when you're doing your prostrations, when you're loving your neighbor, when you're going out to people that have crossed your path and helping them in some physical, material, or spiritual way, then you're being active. And nobody's saved unless they're active. It just doesn't happen. So may God help us to have God resonate in our heart so that we are settled if there is crisis in our life, when there is crisis, not if, but when, so that we will possess our souls We will be in control of ourselves because God is in us. And if God is with us, what does it say? Who can be against us? Nobody. May God bless you and help you in all things. Amen.